Hello and welcome to Model Aviation Live. I'm your host, Jay Smith, Executive Editor of Model Aviation and Park Pilot magazines. Um, as you may be aware, we did not have a show last month. I had originally hoped that we could do a live show directly from the Sig flying. Logistical issues, we weren't able to make that happen. So the focus of today's show is going to be a lot about the Sig fly-in. But before we talk about that, there's a few other things that I want to talk about. One being that if you enjoy building, if you enjoy looking at plans, if you're looking for your winter project, every year to support Build Month in October, we have a plan sale. So there's a plan sale going on right now. You can get 20% off any and all plans that you order through the AMA plan service, and that will be in effect through October 31st. So definitely head over and check out our plans and download or order some plans that for your projects this winter you might want, or future projects that you might want. So we have sold a lot of plans. Obviously, every year there's a lot of interest in that. So you have until midnight, October 31st, to get some plans for your next project. So hope you get to check that out. And don't hesitate to share with us. Sometimes some of the aircraft that we have plans for, we don't have pictures of built aircraft. So don't hesitate to share. If you build an aircraft from the plans, please don't hesitate to share it with us, because if it's one we don't have a photo of, we'll ask your permission and share it on the website so that people can see the built aircraft. So definitely hope you take advantage of that. Also, this kind of ties into what we're going to talk about a little bit later about SIG. But as you probably know, I'm a bit of a collector, and I picked up something really interesting that is very closely associated to our hobby. And it's called the New Lindy Flying Game by Newcraft Toys. Now, I realize that Newcraft Toys may not be familiar to you. However, Newcraft Toys was started by Paul K. Gillow, as in Gillow's model aircraft, and he released this game, and it sold very well. It was a card game, and basically you could have, I think it's 2 to 4 or 2 to 5 players, and what you're trying to do in the card game is you're trying to fly, basically recreate Lindbergh's flight, and you have to fly 3,200 miles. So the first player to fly 3,200 miles wins the game. And there's some cards have, you flew 500 miles. Other say you had to land for gasoline or weather. So there's setbacks, and there's also, ways that you can get forward. And what's really interesting is this was a very, very good seller for Newcraft Toys. But for whatever reason, the game was also released called Lindy, the New Flying Game. So the Newcraft Toys version was called the New Lindy Flying Game, the Newcraft Toys. And then Parker Brothers released it as Lindy, the New Flying Game. There was a lawsuit between Parker Brothers and Newcraft Toys. And I don't know the specifics, but at what happened, the outcome was that Mr. Gillow, Paul Gillow, could no longer sell the game. Parker Brothers won the court case. So the Paul K. Gillow version that I have, that the picture you're seeing is my copy, is very, very rare. But the Parker Brothers version is, even though it came out in 1927, is very easy to find. If you were to go on eBay, for example, you could probably find at least a dozen copies of the Parker Brothers version. So I was actually, after I got this version, I really didn't want to play it because it's in such great shape. So I was actually gifted the Parker Brothers version to play. But what's interesting to me is that this was the start of what would become Gillow's. And if you don't know, Paul Gillow was a World War I aviator. And this is what he started out with, this game, and it did really, really well. And then when he couldn't release this game or sell this game anymore, he went into static wood models to start with. And then from there, they went into the flying models that we all know to this day. And to that point, I actually picked up a Gillow's Helldiver. As you know, my great aunt built Helldivers in World War II. I bought one that's from 1947 in the box. But before we stop talking about the Lindy New Flying Game, I do want to mention that if you're at all interested in it, the instructions are available online. Anybody can go and see the instructions and learn how to play the game. And then, as I said, if you want to add it to your collection or play it, you can find it on eBay for about $20 or so, depending on the condition. So, but the tie-in that this has to Hazel Sig is, and we'll talk about this more later when we talk about the Sig fly-in, but Hazel actually rode with Charles Lindbergh in 1925. She was a passenger with Charles Lindbergh in 1925 when she was 3 years old. And she said that Charles Lindbergh was going around the country giving rides, trying to raise money for his flight that he made in 1927. So I just think it's a really interesting piece of history, and it's interesting the connection with Gillows, because most everybody in the hobby obviously is familiar with Gillows if you've been in the hobby for a little while. So I thought you'd find that quite interesting. Also, I've also picked up some books. I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but there is a book right here, and it's called The History of the Academy of Model Aeronautics, including Part 1 and Part 2, from the beginning to the year 1966. It's written by Willis Brown and Dick Black. This book is available in our museum, not for sale, but the copies of this book are in our museum for research purposes and for staff purposes. And I've looked at it a few times, but I've never had the chance to read it cover to cover. And I just wanted my own personal copy. So interestingly enough, I went to eBay. That's where I got the Lindy Gillows flying game. That's where I got the Gillows Helldiver. And I also found this. It was $8, including shipping. So it was $8 shipped. So I'm looking forward to finally being able to read that cover to cover. Another really interesting purchase I made was Nikolai Sikorsky, the son of Igor Sikorsky that started Sikorsky Aircraft. Nikolai came to one of our AMA expos, Expo East, that used to be known as the Ram Show. And he came because of Sal Calvagna had built one of their airplanes, and him and Sal had become friends. So I had the opportunity to meet him at the expo, and he was just a really, really interesting person. He actually helped in the company and helped when he was growing up, but in his professional life, he was a musician. But he had some really great stories that he shared at the expo. And sadly, he passed away. And interestingly, he had a collection of books, and one of them was written by Eddie Rickenbacker, who most people would know as the World War I ace, the highest scoring World War I ace. And he also owned the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for a while. And Eddie Rickenbacker was friends with Igor and Nikolai. And so when Eddie Rickenbacker wrote his book that's called Seven Came Through, I'll show you right here. Seven Came Through. This book is about when, during World War II, Eddie Rickenbacker was flying to raise money for war bonds and help with the war effort. And his aircraft went down in the ocean, and they were adrift for several days until they were rescued. So this book right here was a gift to Nikolai Sikorsky, and it is autographed by Eddie Rickenbacker, and it is written to my young friend Nikolai Sikorsky. So I had the opportunity to purchase this from a rare bookseller in Ohio, and for me personally, it was just really neat because Nikolai kept this book from after it was published until unfortunately he passed away. And so in getting to know him, it was really neat to have that. And I'd always wanted something autographed by Eddie Rickenbacker. So that's something really neat that I picked up, as well as the new Lindy flying game. And it kind of reminds me, our safety columnist, Dave Gee, wrote an article several years ago. It was a feature article in Model Aviation about eBay and collecting kits. And he had a great picture of him at his computer with just a stack of kits next to him. And I myself am guilty, going to eBay and looking for some of these finds. I also picked up a Scientific, that was the kit maker, Scientific Helldiver, since we last had a show. And that was a control line model that came out in 1953. So There's definitely a lot of interesting finds if you're interested in aviation history or modeling history. I also bought a book that was autographed from a gentleman that wrote it in 1929. He was part of the group that created AMA in 1936. So definitely found some really interesting things, and I really like autographed books, so it was really neat. So I just kind of wanted to share that with you all. Maybe some of that would be to interest you, especially the history of the Academy of Modern Aeronautics. Like I said, we've referenced it many times, but I haven't read it cover to cover, so that's on my to-do list. Now, let's talk a little bit about Model Aviation. The November issue is out now. If you have digital, you can access it right now, and you can see it there. We had a great photo taken by Tom Holman, and that picture is from the FAC Nats on the cover. Tom is also a columnist now for us for RealFlight. He took over for Dennis Norman when Dennis sadly passed away. And I don't think Tom would mind me sharing this with you, but his job is he illustrates book covers. He's done book covers for, I believe, Stephen King and many, many, many books. So he's a really interesting person to talk to, and we're really excited for him to take over the column, the scale RealFlight column. But this is his first feature article. He wrote a feature article for us on the FAC Nats, and that's on the cover. But I also wanted to highlight for those that get print, I know you don't have it quite yet, and I'm really excited about another article in the magazine that I wrote myself. And when the announcement came last year that RealFlight was purchased by Horizon Hobby, I felt that maybe it would make sense to kind of tell the story of RealFlight. How did RealFlight happen? How was it created? Why was it created? What was it like? So I reached out to Scott, who originally started Knife Edge and started RealFlight. And I also reached out to Jim, who later took it over and managed it and owned it. And I interviewed both of them and learned a lot about the start of RealFlight. And I don't want to give too much away because obviously you want to read the article. But I will tell you this. Interestingly, Scott's idea was to do a encyclopedia on CD-ROM. And he was working on this encyclopedia that he wanted to sell to Great Plains or to partner with Great Plains to sell it. So he put all this work into this encyclopedia and, basically defining aircraft terms. They also shot a video on how to build a trainer, an entire video on how to build a trainer. And as an afterthought, he built this in just a short amount of time. He built this very basic flight simulator, but it was more about the encyclopedia. But then there was also this flight simulator, and Great Plains took a look at it and they said, well, we really like the encyclopedia, but we like the flight simulator better. And we want you to put all your effort into the flight simulator. So Scott, pretty much on his own, created the first RealFlight. And the picture you see on your screen at the bottom is a screenshot from the very first RealFlight. So obviously we've come a long way. But after the first RealFlight came out, it did so well that he created his company and hired people and hired Jim as a manager. And Jim also owned RC Groups at the time. And so it's a really interesting story about how this came about and how RealFlight has developed over the years. And the only other thing I'll share, and then you can read the rest, is that RealFlight ended up becoming the top seller by Hobbyco. It originally was number 2 behind Monocoat, and at some point it surpassed Monocoat and became the number 1 seller at Hobbyco. So I was really excited, like I said, to work with Jim and work with Scott and get the inside story on RealFlight. And obviously it wasn't the first flight simulator. There was Dave Brown's flight simulator, and there was also a helicopter flight simulator, but it definitely broke new ground. So I hope you will take a look at that article in the November issue. If you have digital, it's out now. If you have print, you'll be getting it in likely the next week or so. And as an interesting tie into that, I won't show any pictures because I'm sure most of you are familiar with RealFlight, but I also reviewed RealFlight 9.5 in the same issue. So it's 2 separate articles. So you can read all about the history of RealFlight, and then you could read my review of the newest version of RealFlight. And interestingly enough, Since I wrote that, and in the time of it being published, there's now been a newer version of RealFlight that's been announced that won't be out until around the end of the year, beginning of next year. But I hope you'll take a look at it, because it was really first. I've been flying RealFlight since the second version, and for me, it was really neat to talk to both of them and thank them for all their work, because I know that RealFlight has helped me over the years in learning new maneuvers and getting comfortable before I try it with a real airplane. And I told them that you could never count the number of people that RealFlight has helped, either to learn new maneuvers, feel comfortable about different, more advanced aircraft, or even to learn how to fly. So I hope everyone enjoys that. And at this point, I do definitely want to share with you a bit about the SIG fly-in. So I did attend the SIG fly-in in September. It was basically a month ago, because it was when I was due to do the show. So the Friday that I was due to do the show last month in September is when I was at the SIG fly-in. And it was celebrating Hazel Sig, who turned 100 in March of this year, on March 3rd. So there was kind of a second birthday party for Hazel. And there's Hazel there. And they had event shirts that were given out for free to everyone. The event was somewhat sponsored by EAA and AMA. So everyone that attended was given a shirt. I actually had my shirt signed by Hazel. The shirt you see there, her signature is printed with the shirt, but I actually had my shirt signed by her. And I got another shirt that I donated to the museum. So there is a shirt just like she's holding, signed by her, for the museum. And interestingly, Hazel has probably signed more airplanes and airplane related items than probably anybody in our hobby. I personally had a few items signed by her. I had a pilot figure, an actual Hazel Sig pilot figure signed by her. And I also had a piece of balsa that came from Sig signed by her. Because if you don't know, and we'll cover this in a little bit, Hazel will tell you a little bit about the start of Sig, but Sig started out just cutting balsa, and they were selling balsa via mail order. So this was an extra piece of balsa that I got when I toured Sig, that was on one of the machines, and it was an extra that they didn't need for the kit. So I was gifted it, and it just really meant a lot to me to have a piece of balsa that came from Sig signed by Hazel, knowing that that's how her and Pancho, her husband, started Sig. And I also had this Hazel Sig figure that hadn't been sold since the 80s, that was brand new in the package. So I was really excited to have Hazel sign those. And it's also interesting that many people bring things for her to sign, like Sig catalogs or Sig manuals or their airplanes. I probably saw close to a dozen people have their airplanes signed by Hazel, and she loves it. I mean, she loves talking about Sig. So I was very fortunate. I had the opportunity to interview her on camera. The interview lasted about an hour and a half, because Hazel has so much history to share. The history with Sig, the history of flying full scale. She was an instructor for full scale. She, was an aero modeler. So we will likely release that video down the road, but I'm going to share a little bit with you toward the end of the program. But I also, after we did the interview, I actually had the opportunity to eat lunch with Hazel. And I'd met Hazel in the past, but every time I met her, it was just for a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. But I actually sat down with her for an hour and had lunch with her. Actually, we were where the interview takes place, and where we had lunch was in her hangar, where she kept her spacewalker and her clipped wing Cub, which is on her property. Where she lives is in Montezuma. So that's where Sig is, and right down the road, Hazel has her home and her flying site, and that's in her hangar, and that's where the Sig fly-in is held. So I got to interview her in the hangar where her airplanes once were, her full-scale airplanes, and then I had lunch with her in the hangar, and it was just amazing to hear all her stories. And I relayed, if you look at my editorial in the November issue, I shared just a little bit about that. And I'll tell you, I was asking her over lunch, I said, Hazel, have you always lived in Iowa? And she paused and smiled, and I knew she's very witty, and I knew by her smile that she was going to say something witty. So she smiled to me and said, Not yet. That was her answer to have you always lived in Iowa, was not yet. So to me, spending that time with her was priceless, and just hearing the stories. And I'm glad that we were able to capture those on camera. But besides that, SIG was open to give tours. So anybody that came to SIG Flying, you were welcome to come to SIG and get a tour. I mean, what you're seeing there is the sign, that you see from the roadway, and that building just behind the sign is part of SIG. And here's an interesting story about Hazel and about SIG. When Hazel was growing up, she lived right across the street from that piece of property, the property that is SIG that you're looking at right now. When Hazel was a kid, she lived right across the street from that property, and it was undeveloped. It was just vacant land, and she played there as a child. Hazel Sig played there. And when SIG was started in 1951 and they sold balsa, later things picked up and they began to sell other hobby products, and they decided that they needed to have a building. And Hazel bought the property that she played on as a child, and that is the property where SIG is located. So during the fly-in, SIG is open to anyone who would like to tour SIG. And for me, someone that's been using SIG products since the 70s and very familiar with the SIG name, to actually go, because I'd never been to Iowa before. I'd never been to SIG before. So Herb Rizzo, who is the owner of SIG, he owned it previously and had sold it, and he's now back. He now owns the company again, is running the company. He personally gave myself and several people that flew in from EAA a tour. And what you see here is in the research and development area. And I couldn't take too many pictures in there because there's projects that are being worked on that aren't ready to be shared. But as you can imagine, it looked much like the National Model Aviation Museum. The entire ceiling was filled with aircraft hanging, all types of aircraft. There was basically shelving like you see there, full of aircraft. And I took special note in this picture. There's a little green Sig Rascal. It's the second one back. It's not the first one you can see. It's the second one back. That's a little green Sig Rascal. And that one is built from a kit. And I don't know who built it. It could have been Scott Christensen, or, anyone that was working at SIG at the time, Mike Gretz. I'm not sure who built it, but it was really neat to see that, because I really always wanted to build one and make one in green, because that's my favorite color. And so I shared that with Herb, and he gifted it to me. So that airplane that you see right there, that green Sig Rascal, was gifted to me, and I brought it home from SIG, and I got Hazel to sign it. So I'm definitely in the group of all these people now that have had a aircraft signed by Hazel. But it was really neat to be in the R&D department, knowing all the people that worked in there. Claude McCullough, as you know, we have a education center named after him. He worked at SIG, and Scott Christensen and Mike Gretz and Maxie Hester. And to think about all of them working in there and developing the newest and latest SIG products. This picture I thought was very interesting. These are all the rolls of covering in the R&D department. So probably most of those rolls have been used somewhat. Some of them are new, but that's all the covering that they had on hand to cover the new airplanes that they were building and designing. Another interesting thing is Model Aviation magazine was there on one of the shelves. They had stacks of Model Aviation magazine. So it was pretty neat to see that, to see our magazine in the R&D department. So definitely I would recommend going to the SIG fly-in, because it usually happens every year. You get to go see Hazel Sig's property where she flew her full-scale airplanes. You can tour SIG. It's really only about a 5-minute drive from SIG, the company, to her airport and where they have the SIG fly-in. So it's definitely worth it. That's a picture of her airport. So obviously all that grass field is for her to fly off of, and tents were set up. And just off to the right is where her hangar was, still is, but where her hangar was that she kept her aircraft. So beautiful, and it's mowed every 2 weeks and kept up, and just a really neat place. And sometimes Hazel lets full-scale aircraft use it, like when they do Young Eagles rides. She's happy to promote full-scale aviation. So the event The turnout wasn't quite as good as usual because they had a lot of rain forecasted, but it still was a very well attended event. But they said it was less than usual, and obviously I'd not been before. And one thing that was really neat too is there was a B-25 that flew over. We knew when that was happening, and everybody landed. And as an honor and tribute to Hazel, a B-25 flew over, which was really a thrill for everyone. But just the event as a whole was really, really great. I mean, everybody was very welcoming, and SIG staff came to the field and helped out, and they had a cake for Hazel to to again celebrate her birthday. And I was also given, I want to share with you, I was given this coffee mug, and it says "A Century of Adventure," and it has a picture of Hazel in a wagon when she was little, and then it has a picture of Hazel when she was a little older, and then it has a picture of Hazel with her clipped wing cub and the Sig cub. And so this coffee cup. They made a small amount of them for her 100th birthday, and I feel honored to have been gifted one, and really appreciate the time that I spent with her. Now, as I said, we set up a camera in her hangar, and I wanted to talk to her about everything, about flying with Charles Lindbergh, and about starting SIG and running SIG, and about, the people that have worked for SIG, and just there's so much history, and the full scale flying, and her clipped wing cub, and her spacewalker. So as I said, we have about an hour and a half interview, but I want to share just a little bit of that with you now. And what you're going to see is about 11 minutes long, and it's when I asked her specifically about how SIG started, and it started with a table saw because they needed to cut their balsa wood. That's how SIG started, with her husband Poncho and her. And I'm going to ask her about how SIG started and the history of SIG. And I want to share that segment of her interview with you. So it'll be about 11 minutes, and then I'll be back with you. So I hope you enjoy it. Yesterday, I was at SIG for the first time, and to me, it was like a museum. I mean, when I walked into the lobby, there was the saw that started SIG in 1951 that was purchased to cut balsa. Could you share a little bit about the beginnings of SIG and how that came about?
That table saw, we had to borrow $200 from the bank in order to buy that table saw to start our business. And the bank president was Kenneth Cox, and he was the one who loaned the money to us to buy the saw. And here, years later, he still had that saw, and he gave it back to the company. So we had it. That's why they had it there in the front. That was really something that you started with that little bitty saw, and then we had it back. But what we did Poncho taught me to run the linotype. He was a linotype operator, and I don't know if you know anything about a linotype, but it has a huge keyboard, and over here the keyboard is all your lowercase. Do you know this phrase uppercase?
Sure.
Do you know what it means?
Well, with leathers, you have uppercase and lowercase. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but you know where it came from?
No.
Okay. Back when you hand set all your type, you had the letters were in a case that stood at an angle, and the uppercase were the capitals, and the lowercase were the small letters. And we still use the phrase uppercase and lowercase, but nobody knows what it means. But that was what it was. This was uppercase, up here was the capitals, and lowercase was the small letters. And then when we got linotype, we still set type for big letters for ads. There wasn't any machinery that would set anything for ads like that. And printers on the floor always assembled that part, and I ran the linotype, and I was faster than anybody. Well, when I first started running the linotype, I kept overrunning it, and I had to. They had to get a new gear for the linotype to make it go faster, and they still didn't. It still wasn't fast enough for me, and they got another gear, and they got another gear, and that was as far as they could go. And I still overran the linotype because I was real quick from brain to fingers. But I learned the keyboard by watching Pancho set type, and so that when it was time for me to run it, I knew the keyboard, and the first row of letters was SHRDLU, and then the second letter was also the number of letters that were most used. I ran the linotype for 12 years, and in between times we started our model airplane business. We had at home in our basement, Pancho was sawing balsa wood with sizes of sticks and sheets, etc. And we would come home at night and work that business, and on weekends we would do it too. But we still had to work at the newspaper office to make a living. We finally we tried to sell to the distributors, which was the way that things were worked. Manufacturers sold to distributors, distributors sold to hobby shops sold direct to the modeler. But the distributors weren't interested in us. We couldn't sell either to dealers because they didn't know who we were. So we put an ad in a model magazine. Right. Said send for a listing of balsa wood, and it was free. The listing was free. Well, we didn't get any answers. They figured if it was free, it wasn't worth anything. So I said, well, let's charge something for this listing. So we did. We charged 25 cents for the listing. Then we started getting people. They would pay for something that it must be worth something. And then they started buying wood from us, and we were better. Our wood was better finished than anybody else's because he developed a round blade for our table saw to so it would cut better. And then he discovered that, well, now they ought to be able to sand at the same time that you cut. Nobody had ever done that before us. And so he developed a sanding surface, a glue that would go on the round blade. Right. And then we would, the sanding material would stick on that. He finally, we had, I don't know how many 100 blades we had under the saw table, but he finally got it all developed. And this is a man who did not, he went no further than high school. He never went to university or anything. And that is the history of our business. We didn't know that we couldn't do it. And I think, I'm sure that we were the first people to ever sell balsa wood by mail, because it was hard to ship, because it is fragile.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to learn to be able to pack it out so it would reach the person that was going to use it. And also, they discovered that, boy, our wood was smoother than anybody else's. and we ended up, then the dealers started wanting our wood, and they bought wood from us. And then finally the distributors decided that they wanted our wood too. So we were still working at the newspaper office, and we come home at night, and we would work on orders, fill them. I would stamp the wood, sort it and everything else, and we ended up hiring my mother. She came in to work for us at night, and I had a brother who was, he was working at a Ford garage, and he worked at night for us, and then another guy worked at night for us too, and sawing wood. We had a two-story house, and the second story was balsa wood, and I would pack everything out in big boxes when we were selling to distributors, and I slide the big boxes down the stairway to the front porch, and we would set it up so the papers were there for the truck drivers the next day, and we had a brick that held the papers out there on the porch. and then we lived next to a filling station, and it was the access to the filling station, and our house was a little bad, because we were right next. There was only a sidewalk between our house and the filling station, so they had, I don't know what kind of a situation they had to with the filling station to park there to load the balsa wood. But they would come while we were at work at the newspaper and pick up our shipment, and off they would go. And then we bought balsa wood, of course, and it would be delivered while we were in town working in the newspaper office. Anyway, we finally got to the place where the money that we had for wages working at the newspaper, didn't have to touch it to live, and we were living off of the business as it was, and so then we decided, okay, maybe we got it made.
I hope you enjoyed that. As I said, it's just a snippet of about an hour and a half interview that I had with Hazel. And I also had mentioned that Herb Rizzo is now back running Sig and owns Sig. He's the other person in the video to the right of Hazel as you're watching the video. And really appreciate Herb having the Sig fly-in. It actually had gotten canceled earlier this year, and Herb made sure when he took the company back that it would happen. So I think, Hazel and everyone there really, really enjoyed it. And I couldn't help but look at the comments while I was watching the video, and we have someone joining us today who's the Balsa Boy, and I think this episode and that video would be perfect. And then we have someone else named Flight Lieutenant who's joined us from Australia. Thanks so much for tuning in to our show. I also want to mention I did make one little side trip while I was there, because I'd never been to Iowa, and Sig is in Montezuma, and Ottumwa, Iowa is just about 50 minutes away. And you might be familiar with Ottumwa because there's a jet event that happens there every year. But the reason I went is it was in the 80s, Ottumwa, Iowa was the video game capital of the world. And that's because Walter Day had an arcade there, and he tracked video game scores. And so just a quick interesting piece of trivia for you. So here in 1982, Life magazine came to Ottumwa, and they took a bunch of the video games out into the street, and this is right in the middle of downtown. And the people behind the video games are the highest scoring players for each game that they're behind, like the highest Donkey Kong and the highest Centipede player. And so Walter Day was tracking scores. None of the manufacturers track scores. No one tracks scores. And Walter would provide them to the Guinness Book of World Records. So video games were so popular in the 80s that Life magazine wanted to do an article and a photo shoot. So what you're seeing there is the actual photo. It was a 2-page spread in Life magazine taken right in front of the arcade out in the street. And that framed picture hangs in my arcade. If you've watched the show before, you know that I have an arcade in my family room with some arcade machines and some pinball machines. So that hangs there. And I wanted to go and see where that was taken. So I actually visited that street and I took a picture, and that's the picture right there. So in the background of the picture from Life magazine, you can see a movie theater in the back on the left, and you can see it in this picture, the movie theater on the back on the left. And from this vantage point, the arcade would be straight to your right. If you turned to your right, the arcade would be there. And there's actually a plaque there commemorating Walter Day and the arcade. And the interesting thing is Walter Day, to this day, Walter goes to video game shows and conventions all over the world. And he was going to meet me for lunch the day I was there. And he ended up having to go to London, England to attend a gaming convention. So he's a guest to this day. I mean, his arcade closed, I think, in the late 80s. And to this day, he is a guest at all these gaming conventions and gaming shows. And what he started is still continued to this day as far as keeping track of video game scores. There's still a publication that does that Walter handled up until just recently when he retired. So I just thought it'd be interesting to share that little side trip. Obviously, anytime I travel, I'm always interested if I have a little extra time on the way back to see something. So that's what I chose to see. So a big thank you to Herb and Hazel and all the people at SIG. I felt so welcome, and they were so friendly to everyone at the SIG Fly-In. I definitely want to go back again. I hope that you all will be able to attend if that is possible, because it's really a lot of history to be able to talk to Hazel and to see SIG and tour SIG and attend the Fly-In. So that's how we're going to wrap our show for today. But I want to remind you that next month, obviously, we'll have a show again. It's always the third Friday of the month. So our next show is Friday, November 18th. And I look forward to having a guest on the show for that show. I don't know yet who it'll be, but we'll definitely have a guest for that show. And I look forward to talking to you all in a month. So thanks for watching.